I'm Casey Welch, and we're going to continue our conversation about John Fuller and my book, American Criminal Courts, Legal Process and Social Context. In this chapter and video, we discuss the emergence of the U.S. criminal courts. The U.S. courts emerge out of a long history of social control. Social control, of course, is essential for all societies to exist because it is one of the main mechanisms of social order. But when human societies first developed about 50,000 years ago, we had no written language, and certainly no written laws and no courts to enforce those. All social control was what was called informal social control. There were norms and traditions that bound people, and there were informal sanctions that enforced those norms and traditions. This lasted for about 45,000 years. It was the longest epoch of human history. About 5,000 years ago, though, we had the emergence of empires, and with the empires came written laws and central enforcement of those laws. These laws were not as pervasive as today's laws, but we did get from that age of empires the Justinian Code, the Napoleonic Code, the Roman laws, and, of course, the Code of Hammurabi. Nation-states, which became the dominant political structure about 500 years ago, solidified formal social control with written laws and central enforcement of those laws. At that same time, the ideas of the Enlightenment promoted fairness, rational thought, and due process. These principles were integrated into the United States Constitution. But the United States Constitution also introduced another idea, dual sovereignty. This is the notion that the federal government has the power to write laws and develop courts to enforce those laws, and every state has the exact same power. So there's dual sovereignty, meaning that there's federal sovereignty, so the federal government is a political entity, and then there's state sovereignty. Every state is a separate political entity. This system is also called the Federalist system. But this is not a universal system by any means. The United States court system actually is one of several different types of courts that exist around the world. And each of these courts correspond with a family of law. There are common law courts where the judges actually have the power to write law. Then there are civil law courts, and these are the most common around the world. And in civil law courts, the judges are limited to enforcing the statutes that the legislative branch writes. The United States is actually a hybrid between those two. In the United States, judges and judicial rulings have limited lawmaking power, but for the most part, judges enforce statutes written by the legislative branch. The third type of court are religious-based courts, or what is also called theocratic courts. In these systems, the judges actually base their decisions explicitly and overtly on religious teachings. And then finally, there are tribal courts that exist around the United States amongst local native tribes. A controversial issue that's actually emerging in the United States, but under the radar still, is the push for theocratic courts. Now, theocratic courts already exist and are well established and in practice in nations like Iran and Saudi Arabia and some totalitarian nations. In the United States, however, we have the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment of the Constitution. And this prohibits the development of theocratic courts because it states that no law or agency of the government can endorse one religion over any other religions. But there are people in the United States, a lot of people, that would like to weaken this separation of church and state or actually eliminate it. Pat Robertson, for instance, and other Christian organizations has successfully lobbied for the appointment of devout Christians to the federal bench. And these judges have stated that their faith and their religion will influence their judicial decisions. 44 members of the U.S. Congress recently released a legal document stating that the United States is a nation under God's will and that we should enforce God's will. Politicians such as Newt Gingrich and Rick Santorum have stated and argued that the United States should follow God's law, not just human-made law. And then there are activists like Tim Ballard who have written books arguing that the United States has a covenant with God and that we should return to that covenant even in our court system. And then there are some jurisdictions today in the United States that actually prohibit displays of Islam within the court. And then there are some courts in the United States that display, in violation of a Supreme Court ruling, the Ten Commandments, which of course is a violation of the Establishment Clause because it favors or endorses one established religion over others. An ironic part about this push for theocratic courts in the United States is that the Establishment Clause was actually endorsed and promoted by Christian organizations who feared that if one religion became the dominant state religion, the other ones would be discriminated against. And of course, they were correct in that assumption. But now it is, of course, Christian organizations that are pushing to reduce or weaken the Establishment Clause. This is an issue that Americans are going to have to tackle in the coming years, whether to maintain the secular courts or whether to move toward more theocratic courts and religious influence, Christian religious influence in the court system. Thank you for joining us in the discussion of the emergence of courts and the issue of theocratic courts. In the next chapter, we're going to be looking at the modern structure of courts, both at the state level and the federal level. Thank you.